Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to be doing a steering rack swap on the E30, and before we get to it I wanted to just cover a few things, like why am I doing a rack swap in the first place. Well, if you've seen my previous videos, you know that my steering rack was leaking fluid all over the place, the seals were gone and it was time to replace it. But more importantly, I wanted to do a bit of an upgrade to how steering feels on this car, and for that we have several options that you can swap right in. That being the steering rack from an E36, an E36 M3 or a Z3, and they all have minor differences, mainly around the total number of turns lock to lock, steering ratios and how they feel, etc. So do your research if you're considering this and pick the one that's best suited for your application. I personally went with the standard E36 rack because that had the best combination of what I was looking for. Another thing I wanted to mention is that this is probably the hardest and most time-consuming job I have done to date on this car. So if you're planning on doing a swap yourself, I would plan for at least a weekend to get this job done. Do not think that you're going to be able to get this done in one afternoon or a couple of hours, contrary to what you may have read on some forums online or watched in other YouTube videos. So plan for that, and depending on what sort of unknowns come at you during the process, it may take several days, as you will see. And just like most of you out there, I am doing this job with the engine on the car, of course, and the subframe mounted and everything. So this is not a clean build with a clean engine bay where you can easily work yourself around and install the new rack. Alright, so the car is sitting safely on jack stands, we have the wheels off, and we're ready to get started with this steering rack swap. Now we're going to be removing all the power steering hoses from the rack, as well as the power steering pump. And first one is a banjo bolt here, that's a 22mm. I'm going to hit it with the impact and see if it helps. That was easy. I also had to remove this other banjo bolt here from the steering rack. It's hard to see. But basically this is the line that attaches to the steering pump. So now that I have it loose, I should be able to remove the rack. I only have one more line attached to the rack, and it's the one that goes to the power steering reservoir. So I should be able to pull the reservoir out of here now that I have all the lines detached. Alright, so we're getting ready to unbolt the steering rack from the subframe, and there's gonna be two of these. These are 15mm bolt on one side, nut on the other, so I have to grab it with a wrench on the other side before I start loosening. And let's do the other one. Now here's where it gets tricky. As you can see, there is not enough space to remove the oil rack from the subframe because the oil pan is in the way. So you have two options. You either raise the engine or take the entire subframe off, which I'm not going to do, of course. Or there's the third option, which is to bend these tabs a bit down so that you have enough space to pull the rack off, and that is basically what most people are doing. This is steel, so it's strong enough to pull it back and then bend it right back into place. So that's what I'm going to be doing now. Alright, I think that's going to be enough. I hope. So you can see the steering rack is almost out. There are no lines attached to it anymore. The only thing holding this in place at the moment is the steering knuckle right here. so I'm trying to detach the rack from the knuckle so that I can pull it off completely. Alright, so the rack is finally out, and it didn't really give me that much trouble, to be honest. I just had to get some leverage and it came right out. So the biggest pain here by far was removing these power steering lines for sure, and of course bending the tabs and everything else. Now before I do anything else, I do need to take this power steering, the high pressure line off of the power steering pump, so I gotta remove this banjo bolt since I'm gonna be using all the new lines from the Chase Bay kit. So I wasn't able to get the bolt off in the end with the leverage I had, so I ended up having to remove the entire power steering pump, and now I can just hit it with my impact gun. So the steering knuckle is left by itself there, just hanging from the shaft, and next step is going to be to detach it completely from the spline up there by the brake booster. So I was able to finally remove the steering knuckle, and the trick here was to, at least for my situation, was to loosen up this bolt just enough so that this would allow me to stick a flathead screwdriver right here and open up the lock here just enough so that I could pull it off of the spline. It didn't really give me that much trouble. Alright, so here we have the steering knuckle that we just removed from the car, and we also have the kit from Garagistics that will allow me to basically shorten this a little bit to fit the new E36 rack. There's spacers, nuts and bolts, and everything you need to get the job done. First, we're gonna have to basically shave off these rivets here so that we can take these two pieces apart right there, and then add the spacers that we need to basically shorten the distance. So let's get to that. So I'm gonna start off with my Dremel and try and basically grind these rivets down. So you can see here how the rivet is now, I mean the top part is gone with the Dremel. That's what it used to look like. But I think I'm gonna have to drill through it anyways. So I'll try that next. So I was finally able to get these pieces apart. I ended up using my drill bit and just drilling through it all the way until they snapped off. You can see the leftover from the rivets on this piece, which I now need to remove completely. So let me work on that next. Alright, so I basically did the same thing with this part. Once I shaved off the tops, I ended up drilling out the rest of the rivet. And now I just have these plastic pieces here that I need to remove somehow. Maybe I'll drill them out as well. So now I have both pieces pretty much cleaned up and the holes are there already. The idea now is that I need to add the Garagistic spacers onto this piece in order to shorten the distance, right? So this would essentially go something like that. For that, I need to get this spacer on this hole here, and apparently it's just not big enough. I tried pushing it and it's too tight, so I'm gonna have to open this hole just a little bit with the drill so that I can put the spacers in. So I ended up using my Dremel and basically grinded the holes a little bit more, and now you can see the spacer just fits right in. It's perfect. So as a next step, we can expect this to bind a little once it is mounted back on the car. You can see here it's not necessarily smooth right now, so we're gonna grind a little bit of the area here so that there is no binding when I'm steering and everything's smooth. So I'll use my Dremel for that. And as you can see, I'm just smoothing out the edges here, both on the U and the fork here, so that way that feels smoother already. So I'm gonna do that on both sides. So we're ready to mount this thing now that we have all the holes the right sizes, and I've also grinded pretty much a big piece here of the knuckle so that there is no binding. Hopefully it's all smooth. Let's put this thing together finally. Getting this as tight as I can. Have to use some vice grip to hold the other side of the bolt because it's a hex key or an Allen key bolt, and there's no way to put a key in there. So, all right, that's really tight in there. This thing is solid now, and I have enough play, so I hope I don't get any binding when I put this back. So it was right after this step that I started working on the steering rack and ran into several issues that ultimately kept me from finishing the job and installing the new rack onto the car. So I made a whole video on that titled The Steering Rack Swap Nightmare if you want to check that out. But long story short, I ended up having to order a new rack, and I also took the opportunity to get the Chase-based kit for new power steering fluid lines, all stainless steel lines, as well as a new reservoir. So what you're about to see happen after about 2 weeks or so of waiting for the new parts, as well as, you know, taking the time to finish up the project. So here's the new rack that I'm going to be using. OEM, good stuff, and the horrible generic rack that I thought I was going to be using. So what I want to do is make sure that this rack is centered as much as possible. So I'm measuring that I have the same distance on both sides here. So it's about 2 inches, and everything looks straight. And the next thing is to take these new tie rods. I ordered brand new E36 tie rods for the job. So I want to make sure that these are almost the same length as the ones that I had on the car from the E30 to maintain alignment as close as I can before I take it to a shop. Alright, so we're back under the car and we're ready to mount the steering knuckle back onto the spline over there. So let's see how this goes. So that went in perfectly fine, and now I have just to tighten the 13mm bolt to hold it in place. So we're finally ready to try and mount the new rack onto the subframe. Let's see how this goes. I'm sure this will be a lot easier to do it with 2 people, but I gotta work with what I have, which is just myself. Alright, so after some struggle, I was finally able to get the steering rack to slide into the steering knuckle here. And now I just need to put this screw to tighten the knuckle and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So you can just push it up and down until it finally goes through. Once you have the screw in there, you can tighten the nut and the screw. These are 2 13mm. Now the next step is to, now that we have the rack in place and attached to the steering knuckle, is to bend these tabs back into place These are the tabs that I had to pull down in order to clear the oil pan and remove the old steering rack. So let's see how we can get this done. I think I'm gonna have to use the hydraulic jack for this, but I'm gonna try and tab them also. And kind of slowly bend them back into place. And the idea here is that you can pass this bolt back through the tab and the rack. But it has to be completely straight. So I was finally able to get the rack mounted and the bolts through on both sides. It was a bit of a struggle, but I managed to get it in. And I'm also using the garagistic spacers. They're on top here, so you probably can't see them. So, and we need to tighten the bolts for the steering rack to 31 foot-pounds torque. So for my next step, I'm going to be installing the AN fittings from the Chase Bay kit onto the steering rack so that I can attach the lines. I'm so happy I don't have to be bending stock lines or struggling to, you know, accommodate the E30 lines onto the new rack. This should be a breeze to install. There's one. And there's the other one. Look how nice that looks. Oh man, this is so worth the money. Now I'm gonna be installing the new Chase Bay's reservoir. It already has both lines attached. I had already put the stock bracket. It comes with an adapter so that it fits, because this is a bit thinner than the OEM one. I'm just gonna leave it like that for a second while I make sure the lines are routed correctly, and then I'll tighten everything up. I'm gonna put this power steering pump back on. I've attached the AM fitting here already, and the other one is a banjo bolt from the power steering line that comes from the reservoir, so I'll put that one in when I get it back on. This is the one that's hard to reach, so I wanted to put it while I was still, you know, while I had it out of the car. So now I have all the lines attached to the power steering pump over here on the steering rack, and all the way on the top here to the reservoir. Now I need to fill this up with power steering fluid, or actually ATF, and give it a shot and see if there are any leaks. It's full, or it seems, and now I'm just going to basically turn the steering all the way to one side and back to the other, just to see if it takes all the fluid. Seems full. Just gonna give it a start. Seems okay. What the hell is this? There's something completely wrong here. So it took me a while to figure out what was wrong here. In the end, after looking at diagrams several times, I realized that I had inverted the lines that attached to the rack. So the high pressure line was in the wrong place, and with the original lines there is really no way you can mess this up because the fittings are different sizes. Now what I didn't realize is that by using the chase base kit and the AN fittings actually now make these both lines the same size, so you could easily swap them if you're not paying attention. And I was sort of attaching these by hand and not really realizing that they were the same size, so that's why I made the mistake. But anyways, once I reverted the lines, it was all good. Power steering fluid looks okay. It's right at the middle of the reservoir, which is where it should be according to chase base. And the car is running, and I've been able to steer all the way lock to lock. It is a self-bleeding system, so it should take all of the air out. And it feels pretty good. I think I am done with this, or at least this step. Just gotta make sure there are no leaks. Now we're ready to install the new tie rods. They're already measured against the old ones, and I already added the dust boot here, and let's get them onto the rack. So a couple of things on the tie rods install. These are E36 tie rods, so they're marked left and right. You can see the L right here, and you also want to have a locking washer. There's two types. This one here is a little bit thicker, and this one here. I have both just in case, but I'm gonna try the thick one first. I think they all work the same anyways. So this goes like so, and making sure that you have the little tab that aligns with the notch on the rack. So all you gotta do is put some pressure on the ball joint here with your floor jack, and that way you can tighten the nut without the ball joint spinning. There's one side. We just gotta do the same thing on the other side. One of the things we gotta do here with this lock washer is to bend this piece here so that it rests against the flat area on the tie rod. That way it doesn't come loose. So we just gotta hammer it in there. And that should do it. Just be careful not to damage the rack, of course. Alright, so let's do a bit of a test drive and see how this steering rack feels. Now, I had already done a bit of a initial driving test, of course, right after I finished the job, just to make sure things worked. So this is not the first time I'm getting in the car after the swap. and I'm not going to be doing a you know, track test here or anything like that, but I did wanted to share what my experience has been so far with the steering. And you will notice right away after you're done that the steering is much more improved. This is very noticeable. It's not something you have to make an effort to, you know, notice the difference. I felt the difference right away, especially when, of course, taking corners or going through a roundabout like this. The steering is much more direct, and there is a lot less play on center here. So, you know, there's, as soon as I give the wheel some input, I can already feel the tires turning. So this is just one hell of an upgrade, and I would highly recommend this to any E30 owners that have the stock rack. You've probably heard many times people say this is how the car should have come from factory, and of course that's easy to say once you test something from a next generation. So it does make sense, but considering the amount of effort you have to go through to adapt one of these E36 racks to this platform, I believe it is a no-brainer to do the upgrade if you have to replace your rack. And even if your rack is fine and you're looking for just a better driving experience overall, and you've driven newer BMWs and know what that feels like, I say go for it. In my case, I needed to replace the rack anyway, so I knew I was not about to go through all the process just to throw in the same rack. Also, the E36 racks are much easier to find and perhaps even cheaper than E30 options, because there's just more of them out there, so keep that in mind. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the results, and I am so glad I did this. The car feels just so much better. And that will do it for this video. Once again, thanks for watching. Please leave your comments below and consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. I will see you all on the next one.